Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we're going to dive into a really powerful story from the Quran. It's about a people who begged for a king to lead them, but then, when they got one, they weren't so sure. It's this incredible narrative about leadership, about faith, and a huge battle against a giant. And it holds some profound lessons about where real strength actually comes from.
So, let's just start with this one big question. What really makes a great leader? Is it their wealth, their social status, or is it something else entirely? This story gives a deep and maybe even a surprising answer. So keep that question in the back of your mind as we go through this.
All right, so our story kicks off with the children of Israel, sometime after the prophet Moses. They were in a tough spot, feeling weak, they'd been scattered and defeated, and they just felt like they needed this strong, single figure, a king, to unite them and guide them.
So they go to their prophet at the time and make this really bold demand. They say, "Appoint a king for us, and we promise we will fight for God's cause." And look, their reasoning seemed totally legit. They'd been kicked out of their homes, torn from their families. They were ready for a fight. Or at least that's what they said.
And boom, right away, we see the first critical lesson here, the huge gap between what people say and what they do. When their prophet pushed back a little, asking, "Are you sure you'll fight if it's commanded?" They were all in. But the moment the call actually came, most of them just turned away. It's such a powerful reminder that talk is cheap. Making a promise is easy, but the sacrifice it takes to see it through, that's the hard part.
So even though their commitment was shaky, God answered their prayer. But the leader he chose for them was definitely not who they were expecting. And this is where a man named Talut, who you might know as Saul, comes into the picture.
The people's reaction was, well, immediate and pretty revealing. They started complaining right away. They just couldn't get their heads around the choice. To them, Talut was missing the two things they thought mattered most for a leader. He didn't come from a fancy family, and he wasn't rich.
And this right here is the absolute core of the story's conflict. The people were judging by these superficial, worldly standards, money and status, but their prophet had to explain God's criteria to them. See, true leadership isn't about your bank account or your last name. It's about knowledge, wisdom, and physical strength. And God chose Talut because he had those things in abundance. So, to put all their doubts to rest and prove that Talut really was appointed by God, their prophet announced that a miracle was coming. The sign of his kingship would be the return of the legendary Ark of the Covenant, this incredibly sacred object that they had lost a long, long time ago.
So what was this ark exactly? Well, inside, it contained Sakina, this profound sense of peace, of tranquility that comes directly from God. It also held sacred relics from the families of Moses and Aaron. And just to make it clear this was a miracle, the angels themselves would carry it back to them. This was a sign meant to completely restore their faith and confirm their new king.
Okay, so now King Talut's leadership has been established by a full-blown miracle. He gathers his army and they start to march. But his first act as their commander wasn't to go after the enemy. It was to test his own soldiers.
As they came to a river, totally exhausted and thirsty, Talut gave them a really strange command from God. He said no one was allowed to drink from the river except for just a single handful of water. Now, this wasn't really about water. This was a test of something much deeper: discipline, obedience, and self-control.
And the results were pretty devastating. The vast majority of the soldiers just couldn't resist. They failed the test, drank as much as they wanted, and showed their lack of discipline. Only a tiny fraction actually obeyed the command. These were the sincere, steadfast believers that Talut could truly count on. He was left with a very, very small but very pure army.
So the stage is set. This small, tested, and purified group of believers is now marching forward to face their enemy, the terrifying giant Jalut, who you might know as Goliath, and his absolutely massive army.
So when the few remaining soldiers finally saw the enemy, when they saw the sheer size and strength of Goliath's forces, even some of them started to lose hope. I mean, the visual was just overwhelming. They felt completely outnumbered, powerless, and you can just imagine the despair starting to creep in.
But in that exact moment of doubt, those who had true, unwavering faith spoke up. They reminded everyone of a fundamental truth. How many times, they said, has a small group defeated a huge one?
by God's will. Victory, they insisted, doesn't come from having more soldiers. It comes from God, and God is with those who are patient.
Now, their prayer right before the battle is so important. I want you to notice the first thing they asked for. It wasn't help us win. Their first request was for patience, for inner strength, for their feet to be planted firmly on the ground. They knew that you have to win the battle inside yourself before you can ever win the one on the outside.
And then, the climax. By God's permission, the tiny army was victorious. The winning blow was struck by a totally unlikely hero, a young man named Dawood, or David, who stepped up and, against all odds, killed the giant Jalut.
Just one faithful young man, with a single act of courage that was powered by God's will, brought down the very symbol of the enemy's strength. And that one single moment just shattered the morale of the entire opposing army and secured a miraculous victory.
The story itself is just incredible, right? But the Quran doesn't just tell stories for entertainment. It pulls out these profound, universal lessons that apply to all of us for all time. So let's look at the wisdom that the Quran draws from this narrative.
So what happened to David, this unlikely hero? Well, from being a young, unknown shepherd, God raised him up. He wasn't just given kingship, he was given wisdom and divine knowledge, showing us how God's plan can elevate the most unexpected people to do the most incredible things.
So let's just recap the key takeaways here. First, true leadership is about what's inside, knowledge and strength, not superficial things like wealth. Second, faith isn't just something you say, it's proven through tests of discipline and sacrifice. Third, victory always comes from God, not from having a bigger army. And God can choose anyone He wants for greatness, using them to bring balance and justice to the world.
And then the Quran kind of zooms the camera out, placing this story into a much broader context. It reminds us that all the prophets, like the one who appointed Talut and the future kings like David, they might have different jobs or ranks in God's plan, but they all carry the exact same fundamental message of truth from the one God.
And finally, after this epic story about trial and sacrifice on the battlefield, the lesson is brought right back to us personally. God gives us a practical command: spend from what we've given you. It's a call to action, to invest in what truly matters, before a day comes when our wealth, our connections, and our status will mean absolutely nothing.
And that leaves us with one final, powerful question to reflect on. This whole story teaches us that our time here is a test, and everything we have is a trust. So the real question isn't just about what happened thousands of years ago, it's about what are we going to do right now with the time that we have left.